Okay, tonight we're going to start a new part of step 4. So again, if you're familiar with the 12-step and programs and doing the 12 steps, we've said that when people come to step 4, which is this fearless searching moral inventory, that usually there's a couple categories that are considered. So they have to look at their resentments, number 1. They have to look at their fears, and we've talked about that, and the resentments. And then the third one that comes up is that you look at harm done to others, which is another way of saying, look at the areas where you feel guilty for hurting other people. Now, I want to just talk about this guilt thing for tonight and the next couple weeks, because in my experience, it's a huge issue for people in recovery. But I need to explain it this way. What happens after step 4 is a step 5, which says that you then take this moral inventory that you've done and you tell somebody else and you tell God. And so as a pastor and an addictions counselor, I get people coming and say, could I do my step 5 with you? And I usually will fit that in and do that. Here's what I find when it comes to people getting to this harm done to others category. I have had many people sit in my office and go, well, I did this. I stole all of this money. I lied to my parents and basically ripped them off of their savings. I've done this. And they start going through this list of things that they've done to hurt others. And it's a big list and it's significant hurts. But what I'm hearing is somebody reading a grocery list. It's just like, I did that, I did that, I did that. And then the other end of that is I get people doing a step 5. And when they get the harms done to others, it's gut-wrenching crying. I did this to my kids, and the guilt is killing me. And so I go in my mind, what causes the difference? Why can some come to harm done to others and do it without shedding a tear or showing any emotion at all? And for others, the guilt kills them. And that's what I want you to think about tonight. And so we're going to start our talk on guilt around this subject of a conscience. And if you've been in recovery for long, many of you will have heard somebody else say, I've been in recovery for X number of months, and I'm developing a conscience again. Don't know if you've heard that, but that's a common thing. And so what I find sometimes is people aren't even sure what is a conscience. So let's start there. A conscience is something that causes you to feel guilty. Oh, you say, that's bad news already. I'm not interested anymore in a conscience. But you got to take it further. What the conscience is a little internal rat, okay, if you want to put it in those terms. And he's snooping around, and there's a little standard somewhere inside of you about what is right and what is wrong. And every time you go into the wrong category, your conscience says, I'm telling on you, and it starts complaining. And it gets out a fork and it's jabbing you saying wrong. You did wrong, and you feel pain, and you feel fear. Will I get caught? What will happen if I get caught? And so your conscience is this little alarm system that is based on this standard inside of you that is saying you're breaking the standard. You feel guilty. That's what it's about. Now, the problem for people that come out of dysfunction is usually their conscience isn't a reliable guide. Their conscience has been messed up. And there's 3 different ways that a conscience gets messed up, and I want to talk about that. And then there's a 4th type of conscience. So the first one that happens, and you'll relate to this almost immediately if you're a good addict, is that you learn to numb your conscience. So you got that little rat inside of you saying, you broke the rules, I'm hurting you, and you say, go away, what can I do to numb this? What can I do so I don't feel this? And part of your using and even part of not using is that you become this very self-centered person that says, I want what I want, and I don't care who I hurt. Or to say it another way, I want what I want, and I don't care who I don't love. I'm willing to break the requirement of love to get my selfish desires met. And your conscience says, bad. That's not how to live. That is not good. You would not want somebody doing that to you, and it starts bugging you. But the problem is, you don't want to change. You don't want to stop getting what you want. So what do? You numb it. You drink, you get high. You do things so you don't feel it anymore. And I think most of you, if you're honest, you would have to say that part of your using was used to shut your conscience up because you were tired of listening to it bug you. But it goes beyond that. What happens in addiction and even prior to addiction is you learn to shut down emotions. You learn not to feel very much because emotions are painful. Emotions are awkward. Emotions are messy and uncomfortable. So let's just not feel anything. And that's part of addiction, the disconnect from your emotions. But what happens in early recovery, and if you're doing recovery well, is your emotions start to thaw out. And you start to feel stuff again. And guess what you feel often more than anything else is guilt. Because now you can't numb out the memories of how you neglected your kids, how you abused your kids, how you lied, cheat, stole. And it starts to surface. It starts to come up. Flashbacks, memories. And you go, I am being overcome and overwhelmed by guilt, and I do not like it. And guess what that becomes? A trigger to relapse. I need to numb it again. I can't stand all the guilt that I'm feeling. And so I just want to warn you, if you're brand new in recovery, be prepared that if you're doing your recovery well, you're going to start feeling. And you're going to start feeling guilt. And that is going to be a massive trigger to go back into numb mode. And that is huge for a lot of people. Some of you, and I need to talk about this, some of you don't go back into drinking or using. You find other ways of numbing. Guess what those are? You become constantly busy. Because if I'm constantly distracted and busy, I don't have to feel. Or you learn to eat your emotions away. Or gamble your emotions away. Or the best solution, get in a relationship. And then you're good. You don't feel any of that stuff again because you're so in love. Some of you have been down that road. Okay, doesn't work. Just a heads up on that, doesn't work. Okay, so that's the first issue that comes up for people in recovery. Okay, there's a second area, and that is what I call a poorly trained conscience. And this is so significant, or another way is to call it false guilt. And what false guilt is if you as a child were made to feel guilty for something you didn't do, or you were made to feel responsible for something you weren't responsible for. So I'm going to give you a whole bunch of examples of this just so that you kind of get it in your head. So the first example that I would use is dad is angry, and he is saying, if you weren't such a bad kid, I wouldn't be angry. And so now what are you going? I'm responsible for my dad's anger. So if he gets angry, it's my fault. I'm bad. I feel guilt whenever my dad gets angry. Now here's the trick with that. The characteristic or definition of what is dysfunctional. Dysfunctional is one or both parents want to be self-centered. And when they want to be self-centered, what they want to do, instead of saying, you know what, I'm being really selfish here. I want everything to go my way, and I don't want to admit I'm selfish. So what I will do, instead of facing my selfishness, is somehow make it your fault. And many of you got that in a relationship in adult life as well, where if you're in a relationship with an abuser, guess what they do? I want to live however I want to live, and if I'm not happy, or if I'm angry, or if I hit you, it's your fault. Because I don't want to get honest about how messed up I am. And so you learn to feel responsible for stuff that's not your responsibility, and you end up with false guilt. Now I want to go through a bunch more. If you grew up in a family where there was mental illness, so let's say mom lived with severe depression, and every time she was super depressed, she would lash out at you for being too noisy or being too demanding. And you felt, again, guilty that you had failed your mom, and it was your fault that she was upset. So those are the big one. Some of you have lived with the next one, which is dad and mom get a divorce, and one or both of them say, it's because you kids are so hard to manage. And what have you just concluded? I'm the guilty one. I caused the divorce. That's a heavy to lay on a child. But dysfunction does that. Next one. Whenever you grow up in that, you end up going into life as an adult feeling that the emotions of all of your friends are your responsibility. So that if your friend's not happy, you're going, what did I do wrong? Or what do I need to do to cheer them up? And if I don't cheer them up, I'm bad. So you have become guilty every time somebody is upset within your peer group. And that's a significant thing. Okay, got a whole bunch more to go through. I don't know, some of you may have got this. Mom and dad are poor, and they're going to sign you up for baseball. And what do they say to you? Man, you guys, you demand so much, it costs so much money. We're never going to be not poor because you guys have so many needs. Now, what do you walk around feeling? My parents are poor because of me. It's my fault. That's not good. Or for some of you, if mom or one of your siblings was hit, or one of your siblings was sexually abused, and you felt, I should be able to stop this, I should be able to protect my sibling, and I'm failing. So I feel guilty that I have failed my mom or one of my siblings. Some of you grew up where you thought the solution to what dad was saying was this. Dad is saying, I'm angry because you're bad kids. I drink because you're bad kids. So you decided you were going to be perfect. And you figured in your brain, if I'm perfect, then dad will be happy. Guess what? That's not the problem. The problem is dad is messed up. So you try to be perfect, and every time you fail in one little way, you feel guilty. Because now I'm not perfect, so I have failed terribly. Some of you, if mom or dad or a teacher was teaching you a new skill and you weren't getting it, and they were frustrated with you that you weren't learning fast enough, they would call you stupid or walk away in a huff and say, well, learn it on your own, and you feel guilty. The reason I'm not learning is because it's my fault. And you pick up false guilt there. Or for some of you, if you were crying because you fell off your bike and you were punished for crying too long, where the parent is saying, you've cried for 5 minutes, get over it. And you keep crying and they punish you, you go, I feel guilty every time I get hurt and cry about it. That makes me a bad person. Or you come home from school and you start playing in the room with your brother, sister, or friend, and you're making a bit of noise, and dad says, You should have known I wanted to be quiet. And you go, guilty again. I should have read my dad's mind. And because I can't read minds, I'm bad. It's my fault. I could keep going here, but there's tons and tons of this. Not knowing how to do something and then being made to feel stupid, but I want to just touch on the last couple. I don't know how many addicts that I've counseled who have told me that at some point in their life, that mom or dad, out of just anger or exasperation, said, I wish you'd never been born. And now what are you feeling guilty for? The fact that you're alive. And that's a huge false guilt area. Or if mom and dad were hoping desperately for a boy to help out with chores on the farm, and you came along, a pretty girl, and dad is always saying, oh, I wish I had a son. What are you feeling? Guilty for being a girl. Stuff you can't control. And you're feeling guilty about it. So the bottom line becomes this. In a dysfunctional home, if you aren't nurtured or loved or accepted or respected, it is made to be your fault. The reason I don't love and nurture and accept you and respect you is because you're bad. And so kids coming out of that environment have tons of false guilt. Now let me give you an example of this. Last week, Thanksgiving. If you were to phone Mom at the last minute and say, Mom, I can't come over because one of the kids is throwing up like crazy. And Mom said, well, you ruined our Thanksgiving. What would you do? You'd feel guilty all weekend. Why? Because you've been trained that way. You have a conscience that is trained to a standard that is really mixed up. And it's not easy to untrain that. And if you were to walk over to mom's house the day after or the week after, and mom sees you walking in the door, and she goes, what happened? You just felt guilty. That's what's going on here. You've got a conscience that's been trained by authority figures to feel bad about stuff that you shouldn't feel bad about. And that can be a massive issue in recovery because that has a lot of power over you. Because what kicks in next as soon as you feel guilty? I need to fix this. I need to make mom happy. I need to take care of dad's emotions. And you're running around and you're all mixed up inside and totally back into old ways of thinking and behaving. Not a good thing. So what is behind all of this is that parent who is not willing to accept responsibility for their own selfishness, and so they distort reality to make it look like you're the selfish one. Now, I got to add one thing, because if I go through a talk without slamming a church, some of you will think I'm not doing my job. So here's what you got to watch out for. Do you want to know what I see and it just burns me in churches? You get a whole lot of people making up a whole lot of rules and creating false guilt. I, as a counselor, so at Tamarack, I remember the very first time this happened, somebody came in and said, I'm getting a tattoo today. And then they looked at me and they say, what do you think of that? I said, I think it's a good idea. What? A pastor favoring tattoos? Tattoos are bad. I go, I didn't find that anywhere in the Bible. Okay, you get my drift? I don't have to go through the other examples. So the point becomes this. When you get unhealthy people leading a church, they make up rules that suit them. And then they make you feel guilty because you don't live by their standard. And that's not God's standard, that's their standard. And that can do a lot of messing up inside of you. Or the second place that happens, if you get a sick person in leadership and you come and say, I disagree with you, or I don't think something that you're doing is right, guess what you got? A dysfunctional dad who wants to be selfish. He's going to turn it back on you and say, you're a bad Christian. You should not be doing that to me. After all, I'm the leader around here. And so all of a sudden, you can't challenge anything, and you feel guilty if you ever do. False guilt created one more time. Okay, enough of that. I got my rant in on that tonight. Third thing, and this one most of you will relate to, but I want you to understand what's behind it. And that's what I call a calloused or a seared conscience. So if you've gone out to do some yard work and you haven't used a rake in a couple months and you rake for a couple hours, what happens? You get a blister. If you were to go out and rake every day, by the second or third day, that blister would turn into a callus. And what it does is it piles up skin layer on skin layer until you don't feel the pain. It callous. Searing, if you've ever watched the old days before antibiotics and they did surgery or pulled a bullet out of somebody, what did they do? They took a hot, burning piece of metal and they jabbed it onto the open wound. Why? To kill all the bacteria and to seal it, to sear it, okay? So what happens with the conscience is this. A person who has a seared or callous conscience doesn't feel guilt. It's not that they're numbing it with drinking or using or busyness. They just don't feel it. And that would be what you would call the extreme borderline personality psychopath that can kill somebody and not bat an eye about it. Or you get kids today in gangs and in schools, and do you want to know what people are saying? The scary part about our culture right now is kids are growing up with no conscience. They can do the worst kind of things and not even feel any guilt at all. Their conscience is callous. Their conscience is seared. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because since the very young age, you had absolutely no conscience about stealing money from somebody. You had no conscience about hurting somebody, bullying somebody, laughing at somebody. You didn't even feel it. What's going on with that? What causes this whole thing? What was the purpose of the conscience? That little rat inside of you jabbing you? It's saying you're on the wrong path. Make a correction and you won't have this guilt anymore. Okay? So the conscience was to be a positive thing that steered us back into a healthy way of living. That's the purpose of it. Now, what happens in dysfunction? You're criticized. You're made to feel guilty. You're made to feel like a bad kid. You apologize and you're not forgiven. You're shunned. And your conscience is bugging you saying, I'm a bad kid. I need to fix this. So you try harder. You do extra chores. You try to be the perfect kid. And what happens? Does it fix the problem? No, you still get criticized. You still get made fun of. And you feel guilty about it. So what begins to happen in a child? It doesn't matter what I do to fix the guilt I feel for not being a perfect child and for my dad's anger and all of those things. Everything I try to fix it isn't working. I still feel constant guilt and pain. What's my only solution? Sear it. Kill it. Shut it down. This conscience is bad. It doesn't help me fix anything. And so if a child can't fix, they have to come up with another solution, which is shut her down and callous and sear it. And you want what you find with young kids going into gangs now that are willing to shoot somebody without batting an eye? They grew up in homes where they were abused, neglected, made to feel like they were the bad kids. And at an early age, it got so bad, and that nothing they did fixed it. They said, shut this conscience up. And they nailed it away. And now they come into their teen years with no conscience. So let me say this another way. One of the things about finding freedom is we talk all the time that God has built us with 12 needs. and that for 90% of addicts, needs 4 to 7 were not met. So that's the need for love and nurture and respect and acceptance and safety and intimacy and all of those things, they weren't met. Rather, what they experienced was neglect and abuse and criticism and abandonment, excuse me, on and on, all of that stuff. So a kid is made to feel guilty for not being loved. They're made feel guilty for not being accepted and respected and not safe. They're made to feel it's their fault that they're not loved. So their conscience bothers them all the time. And finding freedom is about exploring what happens in a child's life when those needs aren't met. And one of the things that happens is the guilt is so constant that kids shut it up. And they develop a calloused conscience. All because of what happened in their life. Now, what then happens once a kid has a callous conscience? A couple things. First of all, with that callous conscience and being always made to feel guilty comes a lot of anger. And now they will lash out and act out without a conscience because there's so much anger there. And so when you get a callous conscience, it's always connected with an angry person. Secondly, when you have a callous conscience, and then what people do, because some level they know they're shutting down conscience, is they begin to take pride in doing things that violate their conscience. They now take pride in hurting other people. I'm the big shot. Look what I did. That's a badge of honor now. And that reinforces that shutting down my conscience was the right thing to do. And then number 3, what happens when you have a callous conscience and you didn't have needs 4 to 7 met? You become very selfish because now it's all about me, getting what I want. Guess what happens there? You just became the dad you hate. You just became the dad you never wanted to be like. Because now you're saying, I'm going to be selfish. I'm the authority figure. I don't care if I hurt my kids. I want what I want. And you repeat it to the next generation. So where do we go from here? The challenge in recovery is that I expect most of you have numbed your conscience, you have a poorly trained conscience, and you've had a callous conscience. Number 4 is to get healthy, I got to retrain my conscience. That sounds easy. That is hard. Because you want to know something? When your parents trained your conscience the wrong way, they drilled it into you. They reinforced it and reinforced it and reinforced it. And so now, even years later, if you don't do what mom says, you got all this guilt coming up. So it takes a lot to do. So this thing that I want to have as my standard is, okay, I got some poorly trained conscience inside of me, and I got a callous conscience. I want to have a healthy conscience. What then becomes the standard of healthy and unhealthy, of right and wrong? When do I want my conscience to jab me and say, you're doing something unhealthy? What do I use as my guideline? For your consideration, since God designed me, I want to look at an owner's manual. And I want to say, God, if you designed me, show me what's healthy and what's not healthy. And that is a huge challenge, especially if you're raised in churches that mixed up God's standard. And so that complicates it. So you got to deal with that. But I want you to just think of this important. If you don't deal with healthy guilt, you're in trouble. And that's part of making amends and having your character defects looked at and starting to change. Big part of recovery is dealing with all of the stuff that troubled my conscience, rightly so. Secondly, you need to start to retrain your conscience, and all of that callous needs to come away, and all of that poorly trained stuff needs to disappear as well. And you begin to train it, but it is a challenge. And so over the next couple of weeks, I want to talk further about this guilt stuff and retraining this conscience of ours because, and you can talk to somebody who's been in recovery for a long time, if I don't sort this guilt stuff out, my chances of staying clean and sober are really, really small. This is a massive issue. I have had people curl up in a fetal position because of guilt around what they've done to their kids. And it is heartbreaking to watch it. But I know deep inside, if they don't start dealing with that, they don't have much of a chance of making it. But it's tough stuff to work on. Let's just pray. Father, we come to a topic that is very important but very complex and difficult. And I pray that you would just give clarity to people tonight and that they would begin to see the areas where they've developed false guilt and that they'd be able to let go of all of that stuff and not take responsibility for stuff that's not theirs, and that you would just give them the desire to have a healthy conscience. Amen.